Friends, today I want to do just three things with this homily as I've kind of set out to do, to always explain why we're celebrating a particular feast that we're gathered for, especially the holy days of obligation, or maybe today for the Feast of the Epiphany. And I want to talk what real faith is. I started to, before Mass, about what real faith means and what real love means, and why that ties into our gospel today. And then thirdly, how exactly we implement that in our life somehow, and what the story of the Magi can teach us about strengthening our faith and our love. So the Epiphany is celebrated as, the word really just means a revealing. It means something that was hidden before but now is unveiled. So the Epiphany is important because in the Old Testament, the first time God called a people that were, it says, peculiarly his own. If you ever tried saying that word peculiarly, it's very hard to say. So I'm only going to say it once, or I did it twice already. But Abraham was called as the foundational person that would eventually become the people of Israel, God's chosen ones. You know, many people have this idea like, well, God is not exclusive. Well, in the Old Testament, that's actually not true. He called Abraham and not anyone else. Okay, that's the Old Testament reality. And through Abraham and through Isaac and then Jacob and his 12 sons, he formed these 12 tribes and promised them a land where they would have milk and honey flowing. It was the promised land. It was supposed to be in there, for our terms of Christians, it would be heaven. And after time and many wars and divisions, the 12 tribes that were gathered eventually became only 2 tribes. One of them was Judah, and one of them was the Levites. The Levites didn't own any property. Judah is the name of the last tribe, and it's where we get the word Jews from, right? So technically, God never made a covenant with Jews, with Judah, with the tribe of Judah. He made a covenant with Israel, which represented all 12 of the tribes. So it was through this promise and this particular people that were exclusively his own. Remember, he didn't call anyone else. It was this particular group of people that he called. And they were supposed to inherit the promised land. That was the idea. And the promised land, of course, is the Holy Land. When you hear of all the fighting over in Jerusalem and the Holy Land in Israel and Palestine, they're really just claiming whose territory it is. Jews believe that through the promise of Israel, it was given to them by God. And of course, the Muslims say, well, we conquered, it should be ours too. The Christians' only vested interest in the Holy Land is that they get to keep the holy sites open to them so that they can visit where Christ lived. We don't need to go to the Holy Land. We can to visit, but again, because Jesus made himself present in the Blessed Sacrament, God is wherever we go to Mass. And so the very last tribe left was Judah. But through that promise, God had told them that they would be the people that would be the light to the rest of the world. That God's promise in reconciling himself to humanity would come through that particular group of people until today, the Feast of the Epiphany. They carried the torch, and then today the Feast of the Epiphany celebrates the fact that these 3 magi from the east, because in those days, you had one of 2 categories you could be in. You were either a Jew, which means you were an heir of the promise of God through the covenant from Israel, or you were a Gentile, which means you were outside of the promise. The promise was made for people in the covenant, but it was not promised to people outside. So when these 3 magi come, who are Gentiles, they're not heirs to the promise, they're not Jews, and through the star, through the shining of the star, through nature, you might say, through the universe, somehow, they read the fact that there was something significant happening on earth. That's what they would have been doing. The Magi, we call them kings sometimes. I'm not sure how they got the name kings. I think because there were representations of them depicted in ancient murals that had them looking like kings. They obviously were people of some means because they had gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and that was not something easy to come by. You had to be very wealthy to actually purchase that. And so these magi really represent these people from the east with the Epiphany, with the revelation finally that God had revealed that his love, his saving love, was not going to just be exclusively for the Jews or for the people of Israel. It was going to be for the world. That's the importance of this feast today. St. Paul considered himself the apostle to the Gentiles, and Peter considered himself to a people of the covenant, to Jewish people who were coming to the church, and of course that includes us. Again, the Catholic Church is the continuation of the promise to Israel. Remember that your faith, what you're sitting through right now, the Mass, it's not just 2,000 years old. This represents all of history from the creation of Adam and Eve to the new covenant in Jesus' blood to what you're going to receive today and what you receive at every Mass. That you're participating in a history that goes on from the very beginning of time in recorded history and even prehistory. So that's why the Epiphany is important today, because it's the first time that God had finally revealed to the entire nations, to all humanity, that in fact he had come to reconcile them to God. So real faith, real love. What is love? I had a wedding yesterday, and I say it all the time. Deacon talked about it last week in his homily. Love is very simple. It's one of the most confused words that we probably have in our language today. For most people, love means a feeling, and love means some physical sensation. I won't say more about that, but you know what I'm talking about. Love has been always considered a biological function of human beings for some reason that's tied into feeling and emotion, but that is not love. God is love, and although he has a body in Jesus Christ, he is much more beyond some physical expression of it. Love is, according to Thomas Aquinas, even from the 13th century, said, love is to will the good of the other. Love is to will the good of another as the other. What that means is that you love the good of the other without any selfish intention. You love their good simply for their good. You know, I write cards occasionally, and even though I write them and I try to encourage people, maybe if they're struggling with their faith, I'll write them, but in the back of my mind sometimes when I write those cards, I'm thinking, well, I hope they recognize me as a good spiritual person. That would be an imperfect love, because there's something in it for me. The perfection of love would always be that you would do that simply because you love someone for their benefit, just for their benefit. That's what it means to love somebody as other. But the greatest thing that you could will for anyone, friends, in that love, of course, is heaven. The greatest thing you could will, if willing is willing the good of the other, if love is willing the good of the other, then the greatest good you could will for anyone is the fact of heaven. There's nothing better. Now, very oftentimes, around Christmas, we think the greatest thing we could will people is the greatest gift that we could possibly give them. And those are all good. I'm not saying they're not good. But there's something even higher. To desire somebody to have the eternal heavenly beatitude that God has opened up to us. Love is willing the good of other, which is why love is not a feeling, it's a choice. Love must be a choice. Because you can't guarantee that you're going to feel the same way you do about something or someone today as you do tomorrow, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. Love, willing the good of the other, is manifested in the greatest good that God could have done for us in his Son, in opening up to us the gates of heaven through the sacrifice of his Son on the cross. That is perfect love, to will the good of the other as other. There's really nothing in it for Jesus. There's nothing in it for God. You have to remember, God is perfectly happy on his own. Strictly speaking, there's not anything missing in God. He isn't dependent on us in himself. That's what makes his love perfect, is because he created us out of perfect love, not of a need of his. And oftentimes we have that perception of God, well, God created us and he needs us because he's lonely. And that somehow I'm taking something away from God if I keep my faith from him, or if I keep my will from him, that I'm taking something away from him. Or, he's made me angry and therefore I'm going to get back. God is perfectly content in himself. That's what makes his love perfect, because he creates you out of perfect love and not for any need of his own. So willing the good of the other is the paradigm, the model that we have on the cross. God invites us freely into his love, not out of force, out of need, but freely. So real faith, of course, then, out of that real love is manifested on the cross, because God, in reality, came to save us in his flesh and blood. That's what makes faith real. You know, friends, so oftentimes I hear when I talk to Catholics that maybe fallen away or other Christians, they'll tell me, you know, Father, and it's almost before I even ask or say anything, they see I'm a priest and they say, you know, I should really get to Mass more. When's the last time you were at Mass? About 10 years ago. Yeah, you should get to Mass a little bit more than every 10 years. Or, you know, I want to pray, I want to do the X, Y, and Z, but I don't. Again, it's like that analogy I used before Mass about Christmas presents. If you tell your kids, we wanted to get you Christmas presents, but we didn't, so, well, Merry Christmas anyways. You know, we have bodies. We have bodies and souls. It isn't just enough to put our minds in places. We have to actually put our bodies in places like God did. He put his body on the cross. So the three wise men today, friends, follow a star. They didn't know what they were going to find. They didn't simply just sit gazing at the stars, but they packed up, they put themselves probably in an uncomfortable position, and they set out on a journey that they didn't know where exactly it would lead them. They look for the king, believing that there's a newborn king because of the constellations, the stars, and the first place, of course, they go to look is where? A palace. But what they find in that palace is a murderous king, angry and temperate, a ruler just like every other ruler that they've ever known. And think of the insult it would have been to Herod to say, hey, King Herod, where's the newborn king? The one that's going to take your place. Remember, years ago they were talking about how long a pope should be elected after the former pope died. And of course they had to talk about it with the new pope. And so they said, so Holy Father, is it okay if we elect a pope just a few more days after, because we need time to get here to do the election? And he was talking about how'd the pope take that conversation about his death, right? Because he had to die before you elect a new pope. So the question for us, friends, today to get right at it, what are the stars in your life that you need to follow to find Jesus? I can tell you that the night the wise men or the magi saw those stars in the sky, there were many stars in the sky. But there was only one that led them to the baby in Bethlehem. There was only one that actually brought them to the revelation of Jesus to the nations. What is our brightest star in the horizon of our sky of faith? The reality is, friends, is that nowadays there are many stars that are put out there for us to follow. Many stars. Many of them do not lead us to God. I think of just, for example, the stars of things we find on the internet. And though I hate to mention it, but it's important, the idea of pornography, consumerism. You know, and I realized that a few years ago, there was a lot of people didn't realize that when you do a Google search, what you search for is recorded by Google, and they assume that the advertisements of what you're looking for are things that you want, and they follow you around with advertisements on every website you go. Right? My brother the other day said, you know, I had an advertisement come up of something I was looking for 10 years ago. And I said, yeah, because Google knows you better than you know yourself. You may have forgotten you searched for something, but Google did not. Right? And they will even come up with things that you're not interested in. How do we find those stars that lead us closer to Christ? And how do we keep them in our lives, in the horizon of our lives? Because, friends, the reality is that the world, like the night sky, can be a dark place. What are the stars we keep in front of us and keep moving towards in faith? Well, as a parish, friends, my promise and intention always has been here at St. Mary's as the priest, is to put those stars out there for you to follow. That's why we started our whole flock note system and got connected with Bishop Barron's Word on Fire series, so that even though you may not have time to come physically somewhere, you at least, if you're on, many people are on their computer most of their days, you can click on a 10-minute video and allow that star to guide you into a deeper reality or a deeper understanding of your faith. Right now we're doing a series on Mass. I mean, I would guess that a lot of people that are sitting here today wonder why they're here, or how they can get more out of Mass, or whether or not Father's going to stop talking in the next 5 minutes. But the reality is, if you want to enter deeper into something, you have to get up. You have to make a click. You have to do something. It isn't just enough to have a mental reality of your faith. It has to be real. Oftentimes I talk to young people that say what they're really looking for is authenticity. Somebody that lives what they believe. Somebody that's not going to tell them that we love you, but then do things that are contrary to the nature of love as Christ taught us. To love is to will the good of the other as other, and the greatest good is to will to heaven. There are many stars in the sky that will not lead you into heaven or lead you to Christ. But my job is to put them out there, the ones that do. We're starting a marriage program. Bishop Ricken, when he was here a few weeks ago, and Deacon Dave, of course, mentioned it yesterday or last week about the importance of family. Maybe you're in a marriage where you're just surviving your marriage. God doesn't want you just to survive your life of faith. He wants you to thrive in it. But again, that requires to get up and do something. February 2nd, we're going to start a marriage program, a 7-week marriage program once a week here in the parish. You may feel like your marriage is just fine, but why leave it at just fine? God doesn't want your life to be just fine in your faith life. He wants it to be, as the word they use, superabundant. We have programs like That Man Is You that meet on Friday morning. Getting up at 5:30 in the morning, uncomfortable. For a coffee and a donut, that helps a little bit. But the fruit of the discussion, friends, is the fact that you've realized that you have many stars in your life, actually, that there are people that struggle with the same things that you do, and you can find hope in that. And the last thing is, once we make those changes in our lives, friends, when we have the motivation to get up and do something about our faith, the reality is that in 1962, the Second Vatican Council, their primary document was called Lumen Gentium. It means light to the nations. That just as you follow the star and find Christ like the wise men did, so you notice at the last line of the gospel that they went home another way. That is to say, they were changed forever. They themselves became the light to the nations because they experienced the light of Jesus in Bethlehem. You are the church. You are the light to the nations. I know sometimes you may sit here and think, well, no, that can't be me. I can't do that. Well, yes, you can. Oftentimes we receive discouragement as Catholics, and there's two things in particular. One thing, hypocrisy. How people love to call us hypocrites. Why? Because we profess to believe one thing, but our lives we do something else. Now, that's a reality, right? But remember, friends, as Catholics, just be reminded of what we do every Sunday when we come to Mass. In every Mass we celebrate. The first thing that we do after we make the sign of the cross is we say, let us acknowledge our sins. If you want to avoid being a hypocrite, there's one thing you can do. Never profess to be good, never profess to do good, never profess to believe in good, and then you can do whatever you want and you'll never run the risk of being a hypocrite ever. Right? Don't try to be good and you'll never fail. Perfect. That can't be the right answer. Friends, you never have to fear failing if you're trying to do good. Mother Teresa right now, she's caught up because she defended a bishop or a priest that was accused. I'll just say accused. You can read between the lines there. But Mother Teresa defended everyone. I'm sure she didn't know what was going on behind the scenes, but she knew that this priest came and gave them Mass and heard their confessions. And she defended him because Mother Teresa was about love. And she wanted the good. And now she's under fire they're going to try to make her a hypocrite. Well, she dedicated her life to doing more amazing things than most of us altogether will accomplish in our lifetimes. That's what she was called to. But she could have just sat in her convent in Calcutta in the 50s, never followed God's call, and the world would have been worse for it. but she took the risk. The other thing I think that we often have on our minds is, I don't remember. Maybe I should just end it here. The idea of hypocrisy, I don't remember what it is now. Anyway, is that enough? Friends, the point is that you're supposed to be a light to the world. This idea of hypocrisy, that's the other one, Catholic guilt. Right? Somewhere along the line, I'm not sure when it happened, but guilt turned into Catholic guilt. As if you feel guilty about something, it means that you should just try to overcome that. I almost feel like you rob a bank, you steal $1 million, and you feel guilty about it, and you're like with your friends, you're like, well, I robbed a bank, I stole $1 million, and I feel bad about it, but it's probably just my Catholic guilt coming back from me, from my faith. Wait a second. That might be real guilt. And guilt is to the conscience what pain is to the body. You can ignore the pain in the body, but most people know that you probably need to see a doctor, because if you don't see him, the pain will probably get worse. Either that, or you can just block it out completely. Guilt is to the conscience. It means that something is wrong. Something needs to be reconciled. And the beauty, again, the reality of the sacrament of confession helps us to say that it's not just a mental thing between us and God. It actually is something we go to God and we hear from his minister, I absolve you from your sins in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so, friends, make your faith real. Make sure you have stars in your life that you are constantly going to, breaking you out of your comfort zone to continue to live deeper in your faith. That's what the wise men teach us, because ultimately you are meant to be stars in the sky of a world that's often becoming dark, and it's about time that we shine.